appointed ambassador, and he invited me down, and I was really intrigued by El Salvador because they had a 15-year civil war that ended up with a peace agreement. And I thought maybe there was something to learn. And I was talking to the college students there, and I was telling them about civil liberties, and I was telling them about wiretaps. We had this fascinating discussion. I mean, you know, half the kids are raising their hands saying, look, we lost 100,000 people in a civil war, you know, tap my phone and keep me safe. And the other half of the kids were saying there were right-wing death squads running around, killing tens of thousands of people. A lot of them had some government sanction. We have to be a nation of laws. And it was a fascinating conversation, and every country has to reach its own balance between security and constitutional priorities, and I think our country was losing some of that balance. I'll tell you two other things about El Salvador you might find intriguing. I mean, I was talking to all the business guys there, and there's a private armed guard on almost every street corner in San Salvador. And they're not packing a six-shooter, man. They are packing heat. And you just feel like you're in an occupied land. And you know, these business guys are saying, well, it's, you know, so important, maybe we should raise taxes a little bit to you know, pay for more police force. And that morning I had been to a local school, and it was the poorest school I've ever seen, and it was dirt floors and not one textbook. And these business guys were so damn terrified that Hugo Chavez was going to go from Venezuela to Nicaragua to El Salvador, and here we go again. And I said, well, you better watch out, because if Hugo Chavez provides these kids textbooks and you don't, you're going to be right back at it all over again, and rightfully so. I tried to get a read on what happened. They had 15 years of civil war. Really, I mean, it's just like Iraqi-type civil war. It was car bombings and beheadings and just the worst aspects of violence that just kept simmering for the longest time. And then one day they reached a peace agreement. And they had a party-sharing agreement. And both sides are now in the legislature, and it's fragile. Believe me, it's fragile, but it's holding it. You say, well, what happened? And well, a couple of things happened. One, the Soviet Union, you know, ended, and there was a lot less funding for one group. And Ronald Reagan left office, and there was a lot less funding for another group. And after 15 years, I think both of these parties said this is a stalemate, and we have no option but to reach some sort of an accommodation. And it was impossible. They went to Mexico, and these two warring factions that had just been so murderous with each other did reach an agreement. And they did it because they lost a lot of outside funding, and people held their feet to the fire, and they had no choice but to do so. And we're going to see if it holds. I'll tell you a second reason I got into the race, turning the clock back a couple of years. How many of you remember the Bridge to Nowhere? It just drove me crazy. And here it was, a $200 million bridge to a deserted island in Alaska. It was one of 6,000 earmarks as part of the omnibus transportation bill, whatever that was. 6,000 earmarks, and earmark is a little piece of pork. It's written by a congressman, you know, but not identified as such. Submitted at the last moment, sort of under the cloak of darkness. And I just, it made me so damn mad. I wrote a letter to everybody. I wrote a letter to my senators and congressmen, letters to the editor. I said, this is wrong. It's these earmarks that are fueling guys like Jack Abramoff, who trade campaign contributions for an earmark, which is a special little favor they write into a bill. I thought it was bankrupting the United States of America, costing us tens of billions of dollars. And all along the way, we have a transportation crisis in this country, and we're dealing with it in a serious way. We have all these tiny little earmarks out there. And I'll tell you something, Frank. I mean, I can't blame George Bush or Joe Lieberman on that. It was both parties just rubber stamping this and going forward. And I just thought it was time for people to stand up and say there's got to be a better way to do it. The third reason that you all know that I got into this thing was, you know, the war in Iraq. It just seemed to me, whatever you thought about, you know, going into this war, and, you know, I just thought it was incredibly naive, ill-conceived, and wrong-headed, that anybody could think that you could send Judeo-Christian army into the heart of Islam, who will be greeted as liberators. That we're going to bring peace and stability and Vermont-style democracy to that part of the world. But be that as it may, Democrats and Republicans both signed on to that to a significant degree. And I was just inspired by a guy named Jack Murtha. I just thought that here's Jack Murtha. He was a guy who was a hawk. He supported the war, and it wasn't working. It was wrong. And when Jack Murtha stood up and said, we've got to reconsider this failed policy. It's hurting in the United States, and it's hurting what we're trying to achieve over there. And frankly, Republicans and Democrats came down on them like a ton of bricks. And Joe Lieberman said, these critics of the war are undermining the credibility of the president. That's when I said, somebody's going to stand up. We're going to challenge this son of a gun. And we're going to hold his feet to the fire. We're going to go as far as we could. And I went to all the usual suspects in the state of Connecticut, these guys that have been running for office for the last 20 years, and, can't be done. We don't do primaries. We don't challenge within the party. We wait our turn. I said nonsense. I had started up a business, and I wasn't in the mood for waiting my turn. I thought it was time to, let this guy have it and see what we can do. So the Daily Coast got this rumor that there was this eccentric from Greenwich who was thinking of challenging our esteemed incumbent. And pretty soon I had all the local media in there, and they did this sort of one-day article about eccentric millionaire from Greenwich thinks about challenging Lieberman, and then they were all gone. And then I go, oh boy. And then a couple days later in the Hartford Courant, they had a cartoon of a guy with eyeballs like a saucer and a big grin and a button that said, Ned who? I said, boy, this could get really embarrassing. And I called up Jim Dean. And I said, Jim, I think this is a challenge that we ought to do. And he said, why don't you come up to the Silver Star Diner in Norwalk, Connecticut, and talk to a DFA meeting there, and let's hear what the folks have to say. And it was MyDD and Move On and Daily Coast, and actually an awful lot of Connecticut-based blogs. Connecticut Bob, Connecticut Blog, My Left Nutmeg. They all said sort of the same thing. They said, I don't know a damn thing about Ned Lamont, but I know a lot about Joe Lieberman, so why don't you come up and hear what this guy has to say? So be it the Silver Star Diner or Naples Pizza in New Haven or La Paloma in Hartford, instead of having 10 or 15 people curious about the former third selectman, we'd have 100 or 150 people. They were hanging off the rafters. And it just seemed to me that that's what DFA and that's what people-powered politics is all about. And I'll tell you, Chuck Schumer and the Democratic Party and the state, and national, AFL-CIO, all the Democratic establishment said, get out, don't do it, don't jeopardize a safe seat. We don't want you to be a distraction for what we've got to do. And it was just an awful lot of folks like you in towns not so dissimilar from this all over the state of Connecticut that said, hey, people have a right to stand up and challenge, and I think we're a better country for it. And so it was a hell of an experience. We went to the Jefferson-Jackson dinner. I'm sure you have the same thing here, and I didn't know what to expect, because that was all the Democratic establishment. They were, not really too hot about me. And but I sort of walked in there with a little bit of trepidation, and it was a remarkable thing. I mean, nobody was wearing any buttons. They weren't wearing Lamont buttons. They weren't wearing Lieberman buttons. But more and more people would show me the inside of their coat.